Good morning. Welcome to the Wilson Center. If I can make a technical announcement, I think we're going to get a few more people a little bit after the 9 o'clock hour. If you're sitting near the edges and there's spaces in between, if you don't mind moving in, that would be much appreciated, because otherwise we're going to have lots of folks jumping over each other during the course of the morning here. Well, welcome everyone here. Good to have you at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Welcome to those who are joining us via video conference. We have an empty space here between us, but that's okay. You guys want to move closer?
We'll also move to the center.
Yes, that'd be great. We are very pleased to be launching a major report called Shared Responsibility, U.S.-Mexico Policy Options for Confronting Organized Crime. I don't think you could have missed it out there, but in case you did, it is on a big table out when you get in. Please grab a copy. We'd love to have you grab a copy for friends and colleagues who follow these issues. Very pleased that this is a joint project with the University of San Diego's Transborder Institute, led by Dr. David Shirk. We're very glad that David is with us here this morning. This has really been very much a joint project, which was helped by the fact that David was in Washington last year as a fellow at the Wilson Center, so we really could work closely together as we were putting this together. And we also want to thank the Smith-Richardson Foundation and Nadia Shadlow, who supported this effort from the beginning, as well as some of the corporate members of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. There are many issues that link the United States and Mexico. Our economic integration, our demographic integration will help define the future of both countries, and these are important relationships. But there is probably no more urgent issue right now than organized crime that we're doing. This is a shared problem. I often say to people that this is a problem brought about by the largest consumer nation being next to a country that has recently gone through a process of democratization, is trying to build the institutions of rule of law. This was almost inevitable, perhaps. We can talk about the factors that led to the explosion of organized crime and the redirection of trafficking routes and so on and so forth. Their growing weight in the U.S.-Mexico context. But the structural factors are pretty obvious. Largest consumer nation, country that is building institutions of rule of law. Not surprising that we're dealing with this, nor the severity that we're seeing between our two countries. This has provided fertile ground for organized crime to take root and act with impunity and violence. Fortunately, there's also been considerable willingness to cooperate between the two countries, and this has grown significantly in recent years. And the title of this publication, this report, comes from comments made by originally Secretary Clinton and Secretary Espinosa about a year and a half ago, and later by President Obama and President Calderon, talking about shared responsibility for dealing with organized crime. And so what we set out to do, and we started this in October a year ago, with the first meeting of the people who are in this book, as well as a number of other colleagues, was to begin to track the commitments that have been made between the two governments in early 2009. And these were commitments to reduce demand for narcotics in the United States, to reduce the flow of arms and money southward, southbound traffic from the U.S. to Mexico, which drives this trade, increase intelligence sharing, increase military-to-military cooperation, strengthen justice institutions, judicial institutions in Mexico, strengthen police forces and prosecutors in Mexico. And we also threw in the question of protection of freedom of expression in journalism, which wasn't explicitly part of this, but we felt was a significant issue that affected both countries. It affected journalists on both sides of the border. We also, what we asked the writers to do in each of the chapters, and what you'll see here, is to write about, A, what has been done between the two countries, what has actually happened. And the time frame here is about a year, actually. People wrote about, finished their chapters in May or June. A few people updated over the summer. But they're talking about a little over a year of what had gone on between the two countries. So we're talking at the first year and 3 months here. Secondly, what is possible? What more could we be doing on money laundering, on demand reduction, on strengthening judicial institutions in Mexico, on intelligence sharing, and so on and so forth? And finally, what are the obstacles? What is in the way, whether it's political obstacles or actual technical obstacles to being able to deal with each other more effectively? We also commissioned a series of chapters here which are really worth a read. I think they're unique in their breadth and in their depth. On looking at how organized crime has developed in Mexico, the history of this. Luis Astorga and David Shirk wrote a chapter on this on Central America, because this is ultimately becoming an issue in Central America as well, quite clearly. And we wanted to look at the linkages, where Central America fits in the overall trade and ties into the Mexican organizations, and in the United States. And we found that was one of the hardest ones to do. Pepe Diaz-Briceño will join us at some point if he's not here already. It's very hard to do because there isn't as much written on trafficking organizations. A lot written on local trafficking, but not as much broadly. And so he looked at a specific part of this on heroin, but some lessons for the larger understanding. We also get a very good chapter from John Bailey, you'll hear from in a bit, looking at what is the strategy between the two countries, and is there a strategy, and is the stated strategy similar to what's being implemented. Well, there's a great working group that has helped out on this. Diana Negroponte will join us in a bit, Raul Benitez, Jay Cope, Maureen Meyer, Miguel Sarre, Ernesto Lopez Portillo. I just saw Governor Lázaro Cárdenas walk in, who's actually been very helpful in joining us at key moments to offer insight. Ambassador Sarukan joined us in a couple of key moments. Roberta Jacobson from the State Department joined us in a couple of key moments. And so we really appreciate, and there's broader view I'm not mentioning, but a large number of people that really commented on the chapters along the way and gave us some good insight. Before I turn it over to my colleagues who will talk more about the substance of this, let me highlight 4 big picture findings. One is that there is no single strategy that works in dealing with organized crime between the United States and Mexico. We can rhetorically say that this is all about demand, we've got to reduce demand, but it turns out it's really hard to do that. And Peter Reuter's chapter makes this evident. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it's hard to do. We can talk about it's all about the finances, but that's hard to do also. We can talk about it being all about institutions in Mexico. If there were only good police and judicial institutions and prosecutors did their job, this would work. Well, that's true too. It turns out that all these are hard. And so the question is, how do you have a comprehensive strategy where you make advances on all of these areas at the same time? And this requires a great deal of interagency cooperation in each country, actually getting people on the same page. If you're doing money laundering on this side of the border, getting people on the same page so they're actually doing it and they're working together. If you're doing institutional reform in Mexico, make sure the parts of the Mexican government are working together on this. And it requires periodic check-ins in a bilateral setting at a high level. And people, we get calls from reporters who ask us sometimes when there is a bilateral meeting where the key cabinet ministries are involved in the two countries, and nothing's going to come out of this, right? And half the time, that's true in a literal sense. There's going to be no major announcement. But increasingly, we should not expect major announcements. We should expect that the major announcements have been made, and what is happening is that we need periodic check-ins where we make sure that people are actually doing what they're saying they're doing, and that this is actually essential. When there are major announcements, it is corrections in a strategy, but hopefully that people are moving forward on this. So the need of interagency cooperation and the need of bilateral consultation on an ongoing basis. Secondly, a real need to balance long-term and short-term. It is tempting to say that we should go after the bad guys, and that's number one. But we all know if we don't have the discussion on demand reduction in this country, we're going to be having this discussion in 20 years exactly the same. 3 other people are going to be up here. There'll be 2 other panels, with different folks in it. But we're going to be talking about Central America. We're going to be talking about the Caribbean. Unless we deal with demand in this country, and there is no short way. Peter Reuter talks about this at length. He's unfortunately not with us today. He's traveling. But Peter makes it very clear there's no way in the next 5 years we're going to reduce demand in a significant way. But if we don't start now dealing with prevention of addictions and treatment of addictions, we're going to keep having this conversation. And so in the end, we've got to deal with this known universe of addicts out there who drive the drug trade. And we've got to figure out what we want to do with marijuana as well, an issue we don't really get into here. Secondly, institution building is critical in Mexico. We're going to be having this discussion about the U.S.-Mexico context in 20 years unless Mexico is successful in building its institutions, in building the kind of police forces, prosecutors, and judicial institutions that make it hard for organized crime to operate openly. There is much that Mexico can do to push us on demand reduction, and there's much we can do to help Mexico on reforming of institutions, but obviously these are things that have to happen on each side of the border. And in the short term, there's a lot we can do together to disrupt and dismantle the organizations. Go after their leadership, go after their finances, and end impunity for certain kinds of behavior, such as attacking the press, such as going after mayors, such as killing 72 migrants. One of the things that is perhaps a necessary reflection is for a different report. It's not in here, but is thinking, maybe more than going after and trying to dismantle 7 organizations at the same time, maybe we should be having a discussion about how you prohibit in the short term certain kinds of really egregious behaviors. That is a little bit how we manage drug trafficking in this country. We don't try and stop all drug traffickers or dismantle organizations. We do try and prevent violent eruptions and certain kinds of actions by drug traffickers. Third point. And third finding, I think, that emerges from this, border security is best done away from the border. And we do say this explicitly in the introduction. The call in this country is constantly to reinforce the border, but it turns out there are diminishing returns to adding people at the border to try and find drugs, firearms, and money. If you want to take down the organizations of the physical infrastructure of traffickers, you need to take down the leadership and the logistics where it is in Mexico. If you want to take down their finances, You're not going to do it in El Paso. You may be able to do it in Dallas or Atlanta, where they actually bundle the money together. But by the time it reaches El Paso, by the time it reaches Laredo, it is hidden away in vacuum-packed containers somewhere, or it is laundered so well in institutions or luxury goods that it is easy to get across. So the more we think that we can close the border one way or the other, either going north or going south by putting more resources at the border, we are actually wasting a great deal of resources. I mean, which is not to say we should do border security on both sides. We certainly need to do it. There's a deterrent effect. But the real effective work on border security happens away from the border. It happens at the nose where organizations actually do their business in a concentrated way. They've hidden things by the time they get to the border. And final finding on the big picture, I would say, is that the real need to partner with states, municipalities, and civil society. And this comes out very strongly here. A lot of the most exciting work on justice reform is actually, on prosecutorial reform, is happening between states' attorneys generals, between judges on both sides of the border. And this is something different than other relations we have. Mexico and the United States have a different kind of relationship than Mexico has with any other country or the U.S. has with any other country. I've been actually surprised the number of people that we talk to who have deep relationships with Mexico. And they're not only folks at the border. The Attorney General of Indiana just did a major communique with Lee Hamilton, our president, actually, talking about work with Mexico on building rule of law. He's deeply engaged in this. The Attorney General of Idaho, Colorado, Arizona. I mean, there's a lot of relationships going on around Ohio, around the country. Judges, in this country, all over this country, are deeply engaged with their partners in Mexico. Clerks, judicial clerks, are engaged in this. Treasurers of states are engaged with each other. This is a special relationship, and we need to take advantage of these local-to-local partnerships that go beyond the federal relationships. In addition to this, we need to think about how we engage civil society in creative ways, particularly in cities like Juarez and El Paso that are under stress. And El Paso has one of the lowest crime rates in the U.S., but it's still a city under stress because it is next to Juarez and because there's fear there. So how do you engage civil society in creative ways? This is pillar 4 of the Beyond Merida strategy, but it is one we haven't really, on either side of the border, engaged in an active way. How do we see the press as an ally? How do we see human rights organizations as an ally who are trying to improve the work of police and courts and the military to do the right thing and to actually be able to act without corruption? So beginning to see how we build those partnerships between the federal government, states, municipalities, and civil society is critical. And with that, let me call your attention simply to the publication again and to 2 other things. Mafia and Company, would put up on the Latin American program here. Excellent book. Looks at Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. Organized crime. Has a lot of comparative insights. Was featured in New York Review of Books last week. And fresh off the press also is More Than Neighbors, an overview of U.S.-Mexico relations. So, brief ad, and turn it over to Dr. David Sherp.
Great. Thank you. I just want to say what a huge pleasure it has been to collaborate with the folks at the Wilson Center and all of the authors and experts that we worked with. This project, as Andrew mentioned, started over a year ago, and it became a wonderful opportunity. It's one of the most exciting research projects I've done since doing field research as a graduate student, because we actually got to go into the field. We went on several different trips to the border region, to Mexico City, talking with local elected officials, with local experts, with civil society organizations, and got a good opportunity to see how many of these things were playing out. We had the dubious fortune to arrive for our field research in Ciudad Juarez the day after the Colonia Salvarcar massacre, and to see the events of the public officials' responses unfold in the aftermath of that very tragic event back in January of this year. But throughout the collaboration, I think that what's been tremendous has been this spirit of collaboration that we've seen between U.S. and Mexican officials, and that we've participated in, I think, actively as academics and experts working on this issue. I think we're at a high watermark in U.S.-Mexico relations, despite the very difficult ordeals that we're currently facing. I would say that both countries are attempting and succeeding in rising to the challenge of becoming better partners. I'm going to talk very briefly about what we found or how we approached issues on the Mexican side. I know Eric's going to go into a little more detail on some of the U.S. side issues. But when we talk about public security and the rule of law in Mexico, what has obviously been at the forefront of conversations about Mexico for the last few years is the tremendous and extreme violence that we've seen, primarily from drug trafficking organizations. This proliferation of violence has been brought on by the fractionalization of drug trafficking organizations for a number of different reasons that Luis Astorga and I go into in the book. And I think, and also Stephen Dudley, who talks about the impact of these kinds of organizations in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And this violence is what captures the headlines. This is what we see every day in the news. But what I think is something that might be a little bit surprising is that Mexico is not that bad. As bad as things may seem, if you look at Brazil, if you look at Colombia, that's where the real violence is. We talk about 28,000, 30,000 drug-related homicides in Mexico in the last 3 years. Well, in the last 3 years, you had 80,000 drug-related homicides in Brazil. You had 50,000 in Colombia. Colombia is much more shocking because it has 45 million people. So the rate of homicide in both of these places is actually significantly higher than Mexico. So you might say, why are we even concerned about Mexico? I think the reason we're so concerned about Mexico is the fact that violence has increased so rapidly in Mexico over a relatively short period of time. And most important, Mexico is a special case in the region, in the hemisphere, because it is located precisely on our border and because so much of this violence is occurring right along our border. It's incomprehensible that among the safest cities, right next door to the safest cities in the United States, we have a homicide rate of over 100 per 100,000 in Ciudad Juarez. The fact that we have a city like Tijuana so integrated with San Diego and boasting major improvements in security, but still having dozens of people killed each week. Just this week, major incidents of violence. Well, I forget what week we're in, but just this past 10 days, several. I think we've had over 14 killings in the last 10 days in Tijuana that are also drug-related. Mexico matters because Mexico is a critical partner to the United States. It is immediately adjacent to the United States, and it is, as Andrew has pointed out, our critical trade partner for the United States and a critical ally. So part of the idea of this whole project was to bring together some of the best minds working on U.S.-Mexico relations and particularly public security and rule of law issues. On the Mexican side, or looking at the Mexican side, one of the things that we wanted to really focus in on is the role that is being played by the Mexican military. It's gotten a lot of attention in the last year or two because of the escalation of military participation by the Calderon administration. The military's involvement has been long-standing in Mexican public security, but certainly over the last 2 or 3 presidential administrations, it has gotten ever more involved in specifically combating drug trafficking. And Roderick Camp brings this fact into both sort of a larger historical perspective and provides an understanding of what are the implications of involving such an unprecedented number, tens of thousands of troops in the direct provision of public security in Mexico. What I don't want to put words in Rod's mouth, but I think what his ultimate conclusion is that while there is a need and an intention and a need to involve the military while Mexico works towards more civilian, intelligence-based approaches to dealing with organized crime, right now the dominant approach is a presence and patrol strategy that does not have a clear exit sign. Right? There's no clear strategy for how we get the military out of what they're currently doing in Mexico, and I think that is cause for significant preoccupation because what we have seen is, whether they are real or not, is a significant increase in the number of human rights violation accusations against the military and clear frictions between the military and civil society. On the other side, in terms of institutional reforms, what's going on in the background while the military is involved, the police and judicial sector, Dan Sabat, who's going to talk a little bit later, talks about the efforts to professionalize police and develop robust accountability mechanisms and effective systems for merit-based promotion for police at all levels. That's really the key. It's not just paying police better. It's about making sure that there is a system of accountability, a system that makes responsible police and that helps them to develop the capacity to engage their task as professionals. On the judicial sector, which I will be talking about a little bit later, the challenge there is to implement the 2008 reforms, which are very, very ambitious. They attempt to move Mexico towards a more accusatorial system, away from the traditional mixed inquisitorial system that Mexico has long had. And move towards greater transparency, efficiency, and a stronger due process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The last thing I'll say is, as Andrew mentioned, I think on the Mexican side, one of the big challenges has been the task of engaging civil society effectively. And where this comes out most obviously in the book is in Dolia Estevez's piece, which looks at the role of journalists and the media and the fact that Mexico has become one of the most dangerous places for the media to practice their task. And this is critical for thinking about the role and vulnerabilities of civil society, because the media are the eyes, ears, and voice of civil society. And when they are silenced, when they are intimidated, that is a blow to civil society, and it's a blow to democracy. As Andrew mentioned, I think at the end of the day, this is not a book that comes up with the magic solutions or silver bullets, but it is a book that I think offers some very nuanced and I think very strong recommendations on how we can continue to improve U.S.-Mexico relations in terms of the bilateral picture, but also what's being done on the ground in Mexico, and as well as the United States, which I'll let Eric talk about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew Seeley and David Shirk, for being such excellent and understanding partners in this complicated process of putting together an edited volume such as this. It's been delightful to work with all of you, both of you in particular, and the fact that our institutions are on opposite ends of this country could be a little bit difficult, create certain obstacles, but it really didn't, and it was delightful to work with both of you, and David in particular. Having you here was for 9 months? Seemed like a lot longer. No, I'm kidding. It was very, very, very delightful. I want to just make a few more comments here. I mean, my colleagues have hit on most of the issues already, but just to highlight a few things. One is that we didn't take lightly how we named this book or the title you give this book. I guess that's something that all authors struggle with in the end. What is you trying to say and summarize it in 1 or 2 or 3 words? But the title of Shared Responsibility really is a major theme for us. And I think what we've concluded over all this time is that on the one hand, there's been some major steps forward in the relationship, no longer at sort of the official or high level of the relationship do you see a lot of finger pointing. It's the Americans' fault because they're consuming too many drugs. It's the Mexican fault because they're not doing enough to stop organized crime. We seem to have gotten over that particular hurdle, and I think that's a real major accomplishment, certainly much better than the antagonistic, difficult relationship that existed in the 1980s and even during the early 1990s on these topics of organized crime and drug trafficking. At the same time, I guess I can, the person who's kind of captured this the best is Ambassador Arturo Sarucán from Mexico, who often talks about this is the best of times and this is the worst of times. There have been a lot of progress in terms of shared responsibility and acknowledging that, and this is my conclusion, not necessarily his, but as we looked down into the trenches and went to the border and talked to people actually implementing these policies, we found that there was goodwill, desire to cooperate, but there were obviously many, many obstacles to that, putting into practice this notion of co-responsibility and share responsibility. I don't mean that is a bad thing. It's natural as two enormous countries try to come together and solve a very complex problem. It's to be understood, but I think we can't simply say, the words are all right, the sentiment's in the right direction, and everything else will naturally follow. We saw a lot of examples where there was distrust between Mexican officials and American officials, particularly on the border, particularly in difficult places like Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. We saw good examples of collaboration, particularly in Tijuana, but sometimes driven by very charismatic and unusual people, and one is left with this impression that absent those charismatic and unusual people that can work well together, you wonder if this is really, this level of collaboration would exist. So I say this all because we're headed in the right direction, I think, but there's a lot of learning and a lot of that needs to happen at the real institutional level between officials at the ATF and Mexico's Attorney General Office, just to name one example, and that happens in many places. So we're kind of optimistic, but we see there's a lot that needs to be done. I want to highlight a couple of papers. We couldn't get all the authors here. We couldn't cover it all, but I wanted to highlight just a couple papers for people who aren't here this morning, because I do think they have real important things to say. We looked specifically, as David said, at a number of challenges Mexico is facing. We also tried to be very careful and look at some of the challenges in the United States. And some of those involve consumption. And as Andrew has said, Peter Reuter did a brilliant piece on the challenges of reducing consumption in the United States. You'll hear later from Doug Farah about the complexities and difficulties in combating money laundering in this country. I think, as Andrew highlighted, our look at distribution, and specifically at the distribution of black tar heroin in the eastern United States, is a very interesting insight into that little understood world of Mexican trafficking networks in the United States. And I'm pleased that Jose Diaz Briceño from Mexico was able to help us on that piece. And then the other paper that will not get as much attention today is the one on firearms trafficking. And as you might imagine, that got the most scrutiny and questions raised when we first published it on our website. So let me just hit on a couple of points from that paper by Colby Goodman and Michael Marisco. I think, in a way, there's a bit of a good news, bad news element to that report. The good news is that in general, we can say that there's greater cooperation now between Mexico and the United States on the issue of combating trafficking and illegal firearms. I think, frankly, if you look even just 2 years ago, you will see that the U.S. really wasn't focused on this as an issue. I think the State Department understood it as an important issue to Mexico, but the rest of the U.S. government's institutions really didn't look at trafficking of illegal firearms to Mexico as a priority. They were dealing with other issues, and I think only in the last 2 years, 2.5 years, has that become a greater priority for the ATF, ICE, CBP, and other agencies in DHS. So that's a good thing. And one of the outcomes of that has been that the Mexican authorities, through the Attorney General's office, did make available to the United States as over 69,000 weapons that they had captured and categorized from 2007 to 2009. Some of those were captured in 2010, obviously, but the source of this information was that 3-year period. 69,800 weapons, a significant amount. The U.S. traced as many of those as they possibly could. Sometimes it was not possible. But in general, and this is an approximation, about 85% of those weapons came from the United States. Some originated in the United States, some came through the United States, but we see that there was a significant amount of those weapons that were captured in Mexico and made available to the United States coming from the United States. And it highlights really some of the challenges the U.S. faces and also some of the challenges Mexico faces. Now, here's the bad news, and I don't want to overemphasize it, but I think there were 2 or 3 things that came out in the Goodman Marisco paper that are important to highlight. One is that despite, again, this desire to cooperate more in the relationship in this weapons trafficking issue, there's still enormous inefficiencies on both sides of the border when dealing with illegal firearms trafficking. And I think, we can point the finger at both sides here quite clearly. In Mexico, there's a highly centralized process of, when a weapon's captured and is documented locally, then it has to go to Mexico City, and in Mexico City, then they have to ask for the trace request. And so you can see that by the time all this process happens, it's often a year or more before there's any real trace information available. And if the goal here is to combat traffickers, that's a slow process, and there are a lot of ways to make it more efficient, allowing state-level authorities or federal authorities in the states to request traces more directly than having to go through a very centralized process in Mexico City. On the other hand, the United States has its own problems. Several different agencies of the U.S. government have pieces of this puzzle. ATF obviously is an important agency in charge of this, but so does DEA, ICE, CBP, and the coordination amongst those agencies is often quite rough. It's come up in our research and research by the Government Accountability Office, by the Inspector General's report at ATF. There is enormous lack of cooperation, coordination amongst those agencies at different points, and so that too creates inefficiencies in the system. And finally, and this is not explicitly in the report, but I think it's really worth highlighting, I think the United States on this particular issue really has difficulty in making information publicly available on these issues. And we're not talking here about information on specific cases that would come and jeopardize a prosecution, but we had an enormous difficulty gathering credible data from the U.S. government, from ATF, about the weapons, the kinds of weapons, where they're coming from, where they're being purchased. There seems to be almost a culture of not sharing that information. And I think it's problematic, obviously for those of us who are from the academic, scholarly world, but I think it also presents a real problem for policymakers who are trying to decide how, scarce U.S. dollars and resources are going to be spent and how to effectively tackle this problem of illegal firearms trafficking to Mexico. It's obviously in the U.S. interest to do whatever it can to stop or bring down the extraordinary levels of violence in Mexico. We're all concerned about it, especially if you live on the border. Even though, as David has said, some of those border cities are very safe, there is still a concern and an interest in that. And so I think one of the subtexts of that paper is really how difficult it is for the public, for academics, scholars, and policymakers to access that information, that general collective data that would help all of us understand the problem more fully. Finally, let me just hit on two chapters that try to look at both sides sort of simultaneously, if that's possible. One is a paper by Sigrid Arst, former National Security Advisor to President Calderon, presently a commissioner to Mexico's Freedom of Information Institute. And she looks at kind of the historic ways in which Mexico and the United States have tried to collaborate, focuses specifically on the issue of extraditions. Very interesting to see how Mexico and the U.S. have increased their collaboration on extraditions, and how they've done this in a process of re-understanding, reinterpreting their law on extradition. A fascinating account there. And then Professor John Bailey also looks at the strategies undertaken in a more macro way on both sides of the border, not at specific elements of the strategy, but I think it's a very useful piece in trying to get the big picture, that there is a strategy here. We might disagree with the strategy, we might think it's inadequate, but both countries are pursuing strategies, sometimes in conflict with each other, but overall in agreement with each other and cooperating in that. And I think his paper is really worth a read. And John, I hope you will raise some of the issues in your paper in the first panel as well. We're going to take a brief break here and then move to the first panel. I just want to say a word of thanks on all projects such as these, so complex. There's always people that don't get enough recognition for their vital role, and so I just want to take a moment to thank those people. Andrew mentioned we had an advisory board or a working group that helped us. A number of the who's who of Mexican and American academics who look at public security and national security. I would just mention a couple more. Maria Clara Costa, who's an expert on impunity and human rights, was involved, and Raul Benitez and Miguel Sare. If you don't know the work of Miguel Sare on rule of law and justice reform in Mexico, it's really worth looking up and following what he has to say. So thanks to that working group advisory board for their vital role. And then a number of people that really helped behind the scenes, proofreading, helping organize all this here at the Mexico Institute. Vital help of Robert Donnelly, Miguel Salazar, who's in the back and is sort of the captain in charge of this event here, Katie Putman, who is now working for us but from Mexico City, also played a vital role, Chris Wilson, and our two wonderful interns, Sarah and Dana, who are also here, have done a tremendous job of helping us get this all together. So thank you to them. Thank you all for your presence and your interest in this issue. I think we'll have a very interesting couple of panels. And let's just take a 2-3 minute break and let the first panel come up. Thank you very much.
Which means please stand up in place, stretch, say hi to your neighbor, shake hands, but don't leave if you can avoid leaving.
Good job. Oh, thanks, John. Nice presentation. Nice to see you. Thanks, Sarah. And you walk upstairs? That's an issue. Maybe turn it off.
Well done. The wagons. Congratulations, sir. We decided to keep it. Diet. Hey there. Good morning.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, thank you.
tell you 15 minutes. 10 to 12. 10 to 12. Yes.
I mean, yes, 15. But everybody else 10.
You are transparent. Used to wait tables now.
Is this one of the chair's responsibilities? I recently learned that I'm supposed to make my TAs clean my complaints. Somebody said that there's one professor who makes
I never knew that.
I thought that was really funny.
Go around with suits full of white dust all.
But so my TA said, thanks for not making me clean the chalkboards.
He said what?
What? I didn't know I could do that.
Do you know of a gal named Donovan? You ever heard of Donovan? She did a lot of work on it in South America. She was just hell on it. I mean, really smart. I was afraid of her. She was working for a professor out there. I found out later on that the professor had a sharp pencil. She told him where he could put those pencils. And there was this kind of tension. What's going on? And scary. I think TA faculty. She was one of those folks. I don't know all the sounds, but she was.
And then I got okay, I got something. So go back and said, then I assumed that already made my reservation.
I haven't seen you.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for responses from those guys, so I want to bring it in.
Okay, all right. All right, okay, well, when you get a chance, give a call or let me know how things are going and sit down and talk. All right. All right. So you're with us for a year? How long?
A year all the way till December 2011, 18 months.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll have a chance to talk then.
Absolutely. Looking forward to this.
Studies going okay? Are you?
They're going great. Dr. Hayes' class.
Good. That's good. Well, that's an interesting. I'm glad he's here because it's a way to focus on these issues in a concrete way. It's not just abstract.
I was going to ask you about basically the same thing.
Ready? Do we have our panelists? We'll talk. Good. If we could reconvene and get our panel started, we can move ahead. Douglas, are you ready? Nice to see you.
How are you? Nice to see you,
Nice to
sir.
see you. We have Dolia. There's
Dolia
Dolia.
is here. I have seen her.
You do
Hi, how are you?
your
Good to see you. Likewise.
you do your summary in 10 or 12 minutes.
Absolutely. Do it in an hour. I can do it in 5 minutes. You just give me the time.
You know what Mark Twain said? He says if you give me the key word, I can give you the automatic lecture. It's remembering the key word.
That's the problem in all of this.
That's the issue. Our first panel, second panel, I guess it is, panel number 1. It says is policy challenges in Mexico and in the U.S. And we have Daniel Sabet, who's going to talk about police reform, and Dolia Esteves, whose topic is violence against journalists, and Doug Farrar to do money laundering. And If you look in your text, you'll get the biographies of our panelists, and so you can read about their backgrounds and their current activities. I want to congratulate the Wilson Center for this project. I think Americans looking at Mexico are in a state of apprehension and don't quite understand the dynamics and the various kinds of problems and the ways that they're presenting themselves. But I'm hopeful that these kinds of studies will lead more toward comprehension, and we'll get a better sense on the American side about what's really in play there. So I congratulate the Wilson Center. In part, if you look at the subtitle, this is a kind of a step forward because it's U.S.-Mexico policy options for confronting organized crime. That's a very big, it may not seem like much, but that's a very big step forward because the Americans have really focused on drugs. And the issue is really much more complicated than drugs, although drugs is a very important part of it. The issue really involves the dynamics of organized crime. So I congratulate Wilson Center. They brought out a very good report in this case. And then also to commend to you Juan Carlos Garzón's book on Mafia and Company, because it's a very nice comparative study, one of the few we have, of organized crime in three very important countries. And Juan Carlos, I think, is making good progress on that front. My thought is this is a set of topics that needs to be brought into the mainstream when in U.S.-Latin American relations, U.S. policy generally, which needs to get more attention and a bit more understanding in order to develop policies that work better. My own chapter on it, and I want to thank Eric for summarizing, is about strategies, whether the Mexican and U.S. strategies, do they exist, are they working, how can we tell? And the chapter really is about declaratory strategy, that is what governments say they're doing on both sides. And on the Mexican side, there is indeed a very thoughtful, nicely integrated strategy that's been brought out. And it appears in speeches and appears in documents, and you can find it if you talk with government officials. They will tell you different points of the strategy. So indeed, there is a declaratory strategy. And on the U.S. side, there is also a very coherent strategy, again at the declaratory level, and it's the 4 pillars, and it's laid out, it's elaborated, and one can follow it very clearly. The problem, of course, is in implementation. And the implementation has any number of challenges. We'll hear some of these in our panelists, but one of these that I would raise at the outset is the political challenge on both sides of the border. And the political challenge in Mexico, at least my version of it, is the party system has not come to the conclusion that this is really a state threat. And the party system in Mexico still is operating and to use these issues for partisan advantage. And I don't know if you had a chance to read a couple of days ago an interview with the mayor of Juarez, the outgoing mayor of Juarez, who really I thought was very, very frank, and if I read the account right, was basically that Juarez got no support from the state government. And part of it had to do with some political rivalries, although both the mayor and the governor from the same party. I'm taking the mayor's story here, so please, if it's not accurate. But the gist of it was the mayor's police could bring any number of cases, hundreds of cases, that are well done and bring it to the state prosecutor, and the state prosecutor simply drop them. And so it's this disjuncture between the police part and then into the prosecution and into the justice system that isn't working very well. And if we think of the calendar, we are now in 2010, and Mexico is one of these presidential systems, and so there is this prospect of a lame duck president and a frozen political system for the next 2 years. And I think that prospect, I hope I'm wrong, and I hope there are important developments and breakthroughs, and that the system proves me wrong, but the calendar isn't very encouraging. The United States is in elections right now, and so these issues are quite politicized. One won't see much progress on issues such as gun control or that sort of thing. The one way to think about these issues is from Wanda Felbab-Brown, who's a colleague over at Brookings Institution, does very interesting work. I think what's in play in Mexico is competitive state-making, and I'm using her term. And competitive state-making is a government that's trying to implement a whole menu of reforms and try to make progress on any number of fronts in order to deliver an ethical, competent police justice system that's integrated into any number of other programs. And on the other side is a series of interests, criminal and otherwise, that are trying to compromise and shape how this will evolve down the road. And what's very important to me is Mexico, we focused on the violence. There's a lot of attention to violence, and we haven't focused as much as we really ought to on corruption and penetration into the political system, mostly in Mexico, but to some degree in the United States as well. If the violence subsides, the new equilibrium will be different. And I think it will be an equilibrium perhaps not to the advantage of the Mexican government or the U.S. government. One of the issues that we need to bring out is the trafficking organizations have very importantly, I guess what you call it, horizontal integration in the sense that they've penetrated any number of other kinds of activities. Edgardo Buscaglia lists 23 criminal enterprises that trafficking gangs have entered into over the past few years. And so even if these issues are dealt with fairly effectively, there is a tipping point that's been passed, and the new equilibrium, I think, will be rather difficult. What I'm hoping our panelists can help us understand is we're kind of frozen in the middle of a blizzard of events, and we can't get much of a sense of trends and where things are going. So I'm hoping, as I turn to Daniel Sabet and then Dolia and then Doug Farah, that in their comments they can summarize what they've found and give us a sense of what these issues are about. But also, I hope they can give us a sense of trends. Where are we headed with respect to each of the issues that they're dealing with? So I want to proceed in the order that the panelists appear on our program and ask Daniel, if you'd please start, and again, 10, 12 minutes, if you would. Okay.
Presentation up here.
Yeah, that's fine. Good.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for the introduction. Thank you to the Wilson Center and Transborder Institute for having me here today. So my chapter is about police reform in Mexico. Most of my research, for those of you that know me, is focused more at the municipal level. I'm going to talk a little bit more today about things at the federal level. The problem, we all know it very well. While on the one hand, law enforcement should be the primary tool that we use to address the country's crime problems, in fact, the police are frequently viewed as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And we have problems of corruption, we have problems of ineffectiveness and abuse. For those of you not as familiar with the Mexican police, you have divisions between federal, state, and municipal police, and then you have functional divisions between investigative police and preventative police, and sometimes there's separate police forces that deal with transit issues and traffic issues. Here you can see a breakdown. This is from 2007, so some things have changed from them of the distribution of police across these different agencies. The biggest category here being the one at the bottom, the municipal preventative police, which is there's over 2,000 municipal forces in the country. So you have a large number of forces, and this is roughly how they're distributed. Although there has been some changes at the federal level since 2007. You can add about 10,000 additional federal police that have since come online there. So that's just to give you a sense of what things look like. So if you have a problem with your police force, the question then becomes, how do you reform your police force? What do you do with this police force that you perceive or that you have plenty of evidence to say is corrupt, ineffective, and abusive? And there's kind of the predominant model has traditionally been to limit the discretion of the police. If police are abusing their authority, then what we need to do is take away their authority. And so you have preventative police, which are your beat cops, that are sent to work in areas they don't know the area at all, and that's seen as, well, that's a good thing, right? Because then they can't have collusive ties with crime in that area. But it also means they don't know any of the crime problems and certainly can't solve the crime problems. You have them not allowed to handle evidence, although this is changing, not allowed to interview witnesses and criminals, only allowed to make arrests if criminals are caught red-handed. And so the model has been to take away their authority, and that's been the case with the investigative police as well. Elena Azola, Carly Gavales wrote a very wonderful book on the ministerial police, the investigative police, and the title is Investigadores de Papel, Investigators of Paper, that basically, rather than investigating crime, the investigative police are just buried underneath paperwork, and they're sent out to carry out warrants, again, on cases they know nothing about. They're chauffeuring witnesses back and forth to public ministers rather than conducting the investigations themselves. So the model has been, we have a police with problems, let's take away their authority. Well, that might lead to less abuses, but it's not going to lead to a more effective police force. So the police effectiveness might even be worse now than it was in the past. So the limited discretion approach hasn't really worked very well for us. Really the only policy option you have if you're going to take away authority from the police is just to have more police on the street. And so that's been the issue here of putting more cops out on the street, more physical presence. And when the military was called in, that's kind of a replication of that model. Right now we have guys in green rather than guys in blue. The kind of the opposite end of the spectrum there is a professionalization approach, and there's a whole variety of different policies that can, improving selection criteria, improving training, improving equipment, pay and benefits, operational procedures, merit-based promotion, a whole variety of different tools that could lead us from a police force that is abusive and corruptive and not so great into something that is much more professional. We find ourselves kind of stuck somewhere in the middle, which is a militarization approach where you have many of these policies in place where you're trying to improve selection criteria, improving training, improving equipment, but you're not giving the police, particularly the line level officers, any more real discretion to do their jobs. And you have a militarization where the leadership is military leaders within the police, and those are the people that are actually making the decisions. So your line-level officers still are not professional police officers, so we're kind of stuck in the middle here. To give you a little background of how things have developed, really, I would argue police reform did not begin in Mexico until the Cedillo administration in the mid-1990s. You had some things earlier on. The Miguel de la Madrid administration disbanded the Federal Security Directorate, which had allegations of involvement with organized crime, killing of an important journalist, a variety of things led to its dissolution. The Carlos Salinas administration created the National Human Rights Commission, which was a very significant step, although it has been weakened in recent years, very significant step in addressing abuse concerns within the police forces. But really, reform didn't begin until the Ernesto Zedillo administration, where you saw a whole variety of things kind of take place. A major purge of the federal judicial police, about 700 police officers fired, replaced with about 1,000 military officers. And really the notion of if we don't have good police force, we can substitute in military folks really begins to ramp up under the Cedillo administration. And so we kind of attribute that now to Calderón, but really it has a much longer history than that. Creates the National Public Security System, which is very important because now it's essentially a mechanism for the states, the municipalities, and the federal government to collaborate on public security issues. That did not exist before. Creates a federal preventative police before. Before you only police presence was there was a traffic police basically for the highways, and there was the investigative police, but you didn't have a large police force, and so that was created under Cedillo, and initiates FOSEC. That was essentially a large grant program to the states, about $0.5 billion given to the states to improve their capacity. And they were supposed to move that money on to the municipalities so that they could also improve their capacity. And as part of that, it was to improve communications networks throughout the country, create the databases. We hear a lot now about Plataforma Mexico and kind of these unified databases. Well, the infrastructure to do that really began under the Cedillo administration. Also the creation of 911 centers, or the equivalent of 911 centers. Now, not without problems here. All that stuff that was begun, now we're still wrestling with it in the Calderón administration, trying to get these mechanisms up and online. So you have a 10-year period where we've had trouble implementing those policies. The FOSEC, although it was a great initiative to say, hey, we need to help the states and municipalities, they gave the money to the states because that's how the federal system works in Mexico. But that had a real problem because the states said, oh, thanks for the money, and we're not going to give any of it to the municipalities. And so they took the money, and none of it really trickled down to the municipalities. So you had an enormous amount of state waste going on and very little done to improve the municipalities. So there were some problems here, but it was an initial start. Vicente Fox, we can give him credit for continuing the things that occurred under Zedillo. We can be critical in the sense that he didn't ramp things up. I mean, if Zedillo was the start, then you want to see some exponential kind of improvements, and really the improvements were much more incremental. The kind of hallmark of the Fox administration was creating the Federal Investigations Agency, or the AFI, and this was to be kind of an entirely new police force. I mean, this was much pomp and circumstance, and this was really going to change Mexican policing. And they created a civil service. They had really robust accountability mechanisms. They prosecuted over 400 or just under 400 AFIs on corruption and various charges, which they were later criticized for. Right? It was saying, well, the AFI is just as corrupt as the police force. I actually viewed that as a very good thing because finally you had in place good accountability mechanisms that you were identifying problems and actually addressing them. But it was kind of seen as a negative thing that corruption is still present in the AFI. But it was a new police force in a lot of ways, a very data-driven focus on statistical analysis, on collecting indicators, on really basing our operations on good information and intelligence. So the AFI was an important break. In comes Calderon. And at the beginning of the Calderon administration, there was a lot of talk of creating a national police force. Colombia, Chile are kind of the big examples of successful police reform. In Mexico, they have national police forces. The thinking was Mexico needs to do the same. Mexico's a federal system, though, so it didn't really, it was politically dead in the water, didn't happen. They moved to the fallback option, which was to unify. If you have these police divided into preventative police and investigative police, the thinking was that this is very inefficient. We need to unify at least at the federal level. And so that became the next big push. And arguably, the logic makes a lot of sense. It ended up kind of being a bit of a short-term disaster. You had the AFI, which had been this new hallmark of great policing, become completely undermined and many of its powers and resources stripped away from it. And so what was once the centerpiece of police reform now became this kind of hollow shell of an agency. And the federal police becomes, you know, the new star of the administration, and a lot of focus placed on the federal police. You did have some legal reforms occur which created a new federal police with some investigative capacity, which was in many ways reversing this trend of limited discretion. Now, Garcia Luna, the head of the federal, the Secretary of Public Security, saying we need to give our police the authority to do their jobs, and so new authority is given to the police, which is arguably a good thing, although created some concern that, you know, some of the accountability mechanisms weren't necessarily in place for that new authority. But what it did, what the legal reforms did, was you had this new federal police law that was about 30 pages in length, and then the secondary legislation or the secondary regulation that really needed to govern how that police was going to operate it was not released for another year and a half. So at the height of this kind of crime and violence occurring in Mexico, you have the federal government, the federal police force, really operating in a very unsecure, unclear legal environment based only on this 30-page law and without any kind of complementary regulation. So recently they had that firing of 3,000 federal police officers, and it kind of was this one big en masse firing. Well, they had been sitting on many of those for a very long time because they didn't have the regulations in place that provided a legal mechanism to actually fire these people. So, there was a kind of this very awkward transition period. Maybe we're through it, but was certainly at the height of the violence a big concern. The thing that we can credit the Calderon administration most for doing is increasing the amount of revenues directed towards, or the amount of money directed toward public security. And the other thing is really focusing on the local level, creating a program called the Subsamun program, which was a subsidy program, increased local police budgets by sometimes up to a third of their budgets, and had a lot, and was really kind of a smart way in a federal system to use the power of the purse at the federal level to incentivize municipal level reform. And so they said, okay, here's the chunk of money we're going to give you, but to get this chunk of money, you have to match a certain percentage. That has to go to improving salaries. You have to submit your police officers to control the confianza test. You have to have them run through these diagnostic tests on their police abilities. You have to buy this type of equipment. A lot of really good kinds of things to use the power of the purse to encourage local level professionalization. So now, however, the talk is to getting rid of the municipal police entirely and creating a unified police force at the state level and not having municipal police forces. I don't address that much here. I'm very suspicious that will have a significant impact on the security situation and on the professionalization of police forces. The real problem is how policing is done, not who is doing it. So if you just move the powers to the state level, I don't see a really big change in how policing actually occurs. Just to put a few numbers here to the issue of some of the changes here, you can see this is the size of the federal police force and the AFI here, and you can see how the federal police force grew from 10,000 to 32,000. Now it's since lost about 3,000 folks, so it's a little smaller than that. But this is a tripling of the federal police force, so that's a pretty significant thing. And if you look at the money, I mean, it has really, really increased dramatically. So really throwing a lot of money at the problem, and that deserves an enormous amount of credit. If you look at the percent of federal government federal, or the percent of the total government budget, both at all three levels of government directed towards public security, you can see increases here and also in a percent of GDP. To put this number into context, 1.7%, Zedillo did a diagnostic study in 1994, and at that time concluded that 0.008% of GDP was being spent on public security. So this is really a dramatic change. So in kind of thinking about what has gone on here, we really do have to recognize that there have been very dramatic changes in the size of the police force, in the amount of money being thrown at it, in its ability to do training, its ability to select quality applicants. The bar has been raised significantly. When Zedillo came into office, there were only 41 police academies in the entire country. Only 14 of those had education requirements that said you needed a secondary level of education, a middle school level of education. 55% of the police force nationwide had a primary school education or less. All right, so I mean, dramatic changes from 1994 to where we are right now. So we have to recognize those, but we also have to recognize some of the limitations. And here we can see in the I mentioned earlier the kind of gaps in the investigative process. And you can see, even though there's been a dramatic increase in the number of arrests in Mexico, particularly for organized crime and drug-related offenses, increases in the number of crimes being reported and attended to, there's actually been a drop in the percent of investigations that go before a judge, the percent of cases that are actually prosecuted. So you're arresting a lot more people, increasing the professionalization and the effectiveness of the police, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting through the judicial system. And part of that is limitations on the investigative side, problems that is limitations on the prosecutorial side. John, how am I doing here?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, okay. So the good news here is that you have more federal police, you have more major financial investments, you have improvements in training, selection, vetting, procedures, you have new laws on the books that we didn't have before, a better legal environment. You have the national agreement, August 2008, federal, state, municipal authorities came together and said, hey, we agree to do all these things. So not only do we have a law that says we're going to do all these things, but there's kind of a social consensus that we're going to do all these things. And then you have funded that mandate. So that's a pretty good policy environment to have a legal mandate, have consensus behind it, and have the money behind it. I would argue, well, we'll get into that in just a second, and you do have some improved mechanisms for coordination. So on one level, we have to recognize there's some significant improvements here. So why are we not seeing these changes reflected? I mean, why is the security situation so bad? Why are the police still viewed so poorly? If you're telling me there's been changes, why are we not seeing them? One, we do have to keep in mind that this is a long-term process. Now, justice delayed is justice denied, and that kind of stuff, and so we have to also keep that in mind. But this is a long-term process. There have been dramatic changes since 1994. Two, we have to recognize that the police is not an isolated actor. It exists within a political, legal, and cultural context. And particularly, I'm concerned about the political context, which gives an enormous amount of discretion to the executive in office to make the changes that he or she feels is appropriate at the municipal, state, and federal level, which makes reform very easy to start and almost impossible to conclude. That many of the reform policies that are initiated are very fragile, and so you have agencies like the AFI that was supposed to be the hallmark, the new model, the centerpiece, and all of a sudden it becomes this weakened body and is now just kind of a backwater in policing. And so the political environment here is very important. And socially and culturally, we can also look at some other factors there that I won't get into right now. One of the limitations of the policies that have been adapted and developed to address the police have not focused sufficiently enough on addressing corruption and really creating a system of merit-based promotion within the police. And so you can get rid of the old police, put in new police, but if you do not have accountability mechanisms in place, and if you do not have a system where the leadership, the mid-level leadership that's in place can actually is enforcing those rules and regulations, you're not going to see changes. And so this is the system we keep getting stuck in. So we're training police better, we're selecting police better, but those new police that have high school degrees or college degrees and have been well trained, they're coming into a system where there aren't those accountability mechanisms and where there aren't opportunities to really move up through the ranks based on merit. And that's been the big weakness. Now there is a policy, to use John's term, there is a declaratory policy to address these problems, but in practice, this has been the the weak underbelly of the reform process. And then the last part, which I kind of alluded to, is the inability to institutionalize these reforms. Okay? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Could I ask Dolia, would you please present for us?
Yeah, I'm going to stay here.
Good.
Sit down.
Thanks, Daniel.
Well, I want to start by thanking Andrew, who I don't see in the room, Eric and David for inviting me to be part of this very important project on addressing an issue which is of great concern to me. And the fact that we're discussing this issue today in this context is very important, because in the past year, since we started this project, I have seen a increasing level of discussion on the subject of violence against reporters, which was not the case not long ago. And in part is because of this type of exercises, and we are seeing it being incorporated or addressing increasingly more in the bilateral agenda, in the bilateral dialogue, which is very important to be able to tackle this problem, which I'm going to discuss briefly, although there's a chapter that I invite you to read if you want to know more about it. First of all, a quick overview. Killing and attacking reporters in Mexico, it's not a new phenomenon. There's a very famous reporter, there was a case of a reporter that was killed back in 1988. And I'm referring to the case of Héctor Félix, better known as El Gato. He was killed in 1988. He was an editor of Zeta magazine. It's a weekly which is still around. And he was killed by a bodyguard of Jorge Jancron, who's a prominent member of a prominent political family, PRI family, who later on, 16 years later, this man, Jorge Jancron, was elected mayor of Tijuana. And although this case is not solved yet, I'm just using it to tell you that it's not a new phenomenon, killing reporters. What it is new is the number of reporters that have been killed, and the selfish way in which they're killed, tortured, kidnapped, so forth, disappeared. There's not a consensus on how many have died in the last, let's say, 4 years since President Calderon took over in December of 2006. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is a very reliable source for this information, there's been 30 reporters killed in the past 4 years, including some disappeared. The disappearance of reporters or people in Mexico, but I'm going to limit myself to talking about the reporters. It's a phenomenon that many countries do not know or are familiarized with, which is practically missing, disappearing. You don't know if he's dead, if he's alive, if he's somewhere else, desaparecidos. So Mexico is the only country in the world that has reporters disappeared, which is a problem in itself. We contributed to the repression in this way. So there's been 30 reporters killed or disappeared, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. According to other organizations, including the National Commission on Human Rights, there's more of that. They put the numbers on 60 in the last 4 years. The same thing with Reporters Without Borders. But whatever the number is, there are too many. There are certainly too many. In 2009, 11 were killed or disappeared. There was the first woman ever disappeared. She up until now, her body has not been found. She was from Michoacan. She disappeared when she refused to make a deal with corrupt policemen. So two organizations, NGOs, the National Center for Social Communications, better known as CENCOS, in Article 19, which is an international organization, they say that aside from these reporters killed in 2009, according to their annual report, there were 244 attacks against the press, intimidation, physical attacks, kidnappings, but they were released after being beaten up. So 244 attacks in 2009, aside from the 30 or 60 killed. Now, where is this happening? This is important to understand because people think that this is happening all over the country, and it's not. There's a very interesting gap between the provinces, the states, and Mexico City. There hasn't been a reporter killed in Mexico City in the past decade and a half, 15 years. Most killings, well, not most killings, in the past 15 years, all killings have happened in provinces where violence it's higher, where the turf wars between the different cartel groups or organized crime groups happen. It's not in Mexico City where you see the battles. It's in the provinces. For a while, it was mainly the northern states, but now it's spreading to other states. According to CENCOS in 2009, the most dangerous states with higher attacks, not necessarily higher death or murders, were Oaxaca, Veracruz, and Chihuahua. But most killings, most murders in 2009 happened in Durango, Sinaloa, Guerrero, Michoacán, and Quintana Roo. And as I said, for the first time ever, a woman was killed or disappeared in October 2009 in Michoacán. Now, who's doing this? Well, according to Felipe Calderón and his government, it's organized crime, only organized crime. While that can be true for the murders and the killings, it is not the case for these 244 aggressions that CENCOS reports in their annual report from 2009. These 244 aggressions come mostly from corrupt local authorities, state authorities, municipalities, police, and this is documented by CPJ and many other NGOs. According to CPJ, 61% of the perpetrators belong to organized crime and 22% belong to either police or military officials. Now, this is being disputed by other NGOs. The NGOs don't have a clear consensus on what's happening with the with specific cases or the statistics which they have to gather because the government doesn't provide that kind of statistics. Nevertheless, they do agree that it's a deep crisis, what the media is going through in Mexico. Now, what has been the government response so far? There's two important issues here or flaws that it's worth emphasizing as when we analyze the government response. First, impunity. Impunity is a major problem in Mexico, and it's a major problem when you come to discuss crimes against reporters. Again, there's no consensus on how high impunity is. There is a consensus, it's very high. The National Commission on Human Rights says there's 96% of impunity on crimes against reporters. The CPJ says it's 89, CENCOS says it's 98. Nevertheless, there is a very high level of impunity above the international average, and obviously impunity fuels impunity. There hasn't been one case, and this is in the chapter I wrote for the book, and one case of a reporter that has been murdered that has been completely solved or entirely solved. So obviously, there's no price in killing a reporter or attacking a reporter. So there is a reason why this has increased. And the other big problem that we have in Mexico is that there is no legal framework to protect freedom of the press or freedom of expression or the job of a reporter. A crime against reporter or a murder against reporter that comes from organized crime or drug trafficking organizations, it's considered a state crime, or it goes to the fuero común, because we don't have a law that criminalizes crimes against reporters in the federal law. There is a bill that President Calderon presented to Congress in 2008, but it didn't. It's stalled in Congress. It was passed in the lower chamber, the Cámara de Diputados, but it went nowhere in the Senate. Right now, no one is really pushing it, although President Calderon made a commitment to the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and the Inter-American Press Association. Just last month, they visited Mexico, alarmed with the situation, with nothing being done, with the level of impunity, with the fact that this bill, better known as the federalization bill, is not going anywhere. And President Calderon spent 45 minutes with his delegation in Los Pinos, in his office, and promised that he was going to push for this, that he understood the problem, that he was very concerned with the fact that Mexico is being seen, portrayed with absolute good reason as one of the worst countries to practice journalism in the world. They are comparing it to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to Somalia, to some of these countries which are not democratic at all. So Calderon promised to push the federalization bill. It would be very important if he does, if this law is passed and there is a legal framework that protects journalism and reporters. But so far, it has gone nowhere, and this is one of the things that we have the spotlight on, and the organizations like the UN, the Organization of American States, and all the international NGOs that look at this problem are, watching very closely if this is going to happen. Obviously, inside Mexico, there's a very high skepticism among reporters and the media that something is going to be done in terms of the federalization bill in the last 2 years of the Calderon administration. Now, let me just mention the media response, because this is another problem we have. Obviously, impunity also breeds apathy, not only within Mexican society, but among the reporters. The reporters are no exceptions as a gremio, as a profession. And the fact that no killings are happening in Mexico City, and Mexico City is the base or the headquarters for the major, more powerful, influential media, starting with Televisa, which is one of the two main networks. We have a duopolio in Mexico, Televisa and TV Azteca, and they carry a lot of power. And the fact that they're reporters, although some of the Televisa reporters have been killed in Acapulco or harassed or beaten in other places, they haven't touched yet the Mexico City-based, the big media names, the big celebrities, if you want to call them, because they go even to that field of becoming a big celebrity in the media. They haven't touched them. So this has, in a way, explained, although not justify, the lack of solidarity with the media reporters or with the reporters in small towns. Now, lately, there's more attention being put in the case of Ciudad Juárez because it's so dramatic and concerning that some of the Mexico City media are paying very close attention. But to the extent that there is not what we saw in Colombia back in the 80s, where the big media in Bogotá, El Espectador, El Tiempo, Radio Caracol, they all got together and said, this has to stop. Of course, they were being bombed in front of their headquarters in Bogotá. To the extent that that's not happening in Mexico City, there isn't a national movement or countrywide movement of solidarity to demand, because they have the power to demand this to the government, to put a stop to impunity, to put a stop to the attacks on reporters. So this has led to a very serious problem, which is censorship. In the beginning it was self-censorship, now is narco-censorship. It's a new term that we also came up with it in Mexico. And as the LA Times reported, narco-censorship, it's when reporters and editors, out of fear or caution, are forced to write what the traffickers want them to write, or to simply refrain from publishing the whole truth. This is very, very dangerous in a democracy. It doesn't only put the democracy in risk, but as David said, civil society and society as a whole. But this is what's happening. There was this very dramatic editorial in El Diario last month, in which El Diario asked, what do you want us to do? Address the cartels, because we recognize the inability of the state, the inability of the authorities to protect us. So we don't want to die. What do you want us to do? What do you want us to cover? What are we allowed to cover? So that's very, very serious. I'm told I only have 2 minutes, so let me just conclude this thought. So in concluding, obviously when a reporter is murdered, is kidnapped, is disappeared, is attacked, is intimidated, or bought, because that's the thing, they get bought also. There's a famous phrase, we don't like the silence, but it's survival, one reporter told me. So when all this happens, when a reporter is murdered, kidnapped, disappeared, attacked, intimidated, or bought, when a reporter stops publishing or censors or distorts what he or she publishes for fear or for reasons of survival, society and the public are deprived not only of something they deserve, but of a fundamental right, an international right in the UN Charter, a right in the Mexican Constitution, and that is a right to know and be informed. So thank you very much. And I just want to extend an invitation to all of you. On November 6th, we're going to have here the Committee to Protect Journalists. They're going to present here in Washington their new report, which is called Silence of Death in Mexico's Press. Crime, violence, and corruption are destroying the country's journalism. And this is going to be here November 8th. Thank you.
Lilia, thank you very much. Doug, would you please present for us?
Yes, thank you all for coming, and thanks especially to the Woodrow Wilson folks for putting on this event and allowing me to participate in it. Working with Eric, David, and Andrew was really an enjoyable experience, and I think we really did produce a document in the end that's quite wide-ranging in how it looks at the different dynamics between the two countries. I guess what struck me in looking at the money laundering issue and the bulk cash shipment issue is that the only thing that hasn't changed in the last 20 years of my looking at how money moves in the narco world is the amazing adaptability of the criminal organizations and their ability to stay many steps ahead of where we are as we look at them. One of the striking things in going back and looking at this in a more systematic way, I'd also done some work on this for the U.S. government a year before. And what's striking is how closely we look at the bulk cash shipment and money laundering issues as they relate to Colombia in the 1980s. There's very little new thinking or new realization of how much further on the narco organizations have gone in their thinking and their methodology, their adaptation, than how we look at them. I just want to highlight a few of these issues that I think John was talking about, trends. I think that I think you have to recognize that whatever we know in this particular issue, or not anything, but the vast majority of what we know is a snapshot of recently past history. We know very little about what's going on now because we're not involved. Most of us, at least I hope, most of us are not involved in that particular activity. My favorite, not favorite, one of my most instructive experiences as a Washington Post reporter was when I was doing a big project on money laundering in Colombia, the Cali cartel, and I knew people in the Cali cartel, and we got together some people, and we did this big 2-part series, and I was talking to the Colombian narcos, and they were saying, this is how we did it, wrote this big piece, and I was so excited, and everybody was like, this is a great piece, Doug, oh, it's going to win lots of awards, and then not being too bright at that point, it took me a few weeks to twig to the fact, like, why did they actually tell me this, So I went back and I ran, and the main source who had facilitated my entree into the Cali folks, I said, why'd you guys talk to me? And he said, are you stupid? And I said, I don't think so. Why? And he said, we don't do that stuff anymore. He said, the DA didn't know that. You didn't know that. You looked really good, right? Everybody was happy. If I told you what we're doing now, they'd kill me. I'm not stupid. But he said, you knew more than anybody else, right? So I said, well, yeah, I guess so. So it's very instructive to realize how little we know and how many steps behind we are as this process goes forward. But that doesn't mean we can't look at how things, with the tools available to different groups to do different things as they move forward, and the different changes in the environment in the region that facilitate how things will shift. One of the things I think that's really changed in the region is the dollarization of the different economies. You now have El Salvador, Panama, and Ecuador with dollarized economies, and Mexico with a substantially dollarized economy, although many transactions are not supposed to take place in dollars. They actually do, and this avoids the whole problem that the Colombians had for so long with the black market peso exchange of having to convert their money back into a local currency to make it usable to them. The other hugely changing dynamic is the role that I've written about in this report and elsewhere of Ecuador in the process because of the FARC's access to the Ecuadorian border, their ability to penetrate that financial structure, and the ability of Mexican cartels to deal directly with the FARC's 48th Front and 27th Front on the border there, who can turn over the drugs in Ecuador, the cocaine in Ecuador, and receive the dollars in Ecuador, deposit in Ecuadorian accounts. And the cartels can simply take their money, take the cocaine and move it to the coast and then begin the transit north, but they're no longer the Colombian middlemen in between. And that's the other, I think, huge shift, is that the Colombian organizations are no longer what they used to be. And the Mexican cartels have moved into areas where they had not been in prior years. In the 1980s, early 1990s, when the Colombians were consolidating their coca cultivation into Colombia as opposed to Bolivia and Peru, they actually sent people down to kill Bolivians who were trying to produce HCl, the final product, the cocaine you stick up your nose, because that was the high-end product that the Colombians wanted to protect. That Colombian control is gone now. So you have large-scale HCl production now in Bolivia, in Peru, with the Mexican cartels moving in to buy it as opposed to the Colombians. So that's a significant shift. The other thing I think that this dynamic has changed is this might be in some ways good news for Mexico and bad news for how we look at the problem. That we're fixated on bulk cash shipments, which are, I think, incredibly important for the walking around money that the cartels use. They need to get that money in Ciudad Juarez, in other places, to pay the guys on the street, to keep the product flowing, to keep the plaza sort of oiled. But it's not the bulk of the money any longer. And I argue in my chapter, because so much more money they spend about 70% of their money that they generate on buying new product. And that money gets pushed through to Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and elsewhere. And that money that percentage no longer needs to go through Mexico. That money bypasses Mexico almost in its totality, and so this huge focus on thinking that there are billions of dollars in bulk cash shipment, I think, is simply no longer true. And I can talk a little bit about the other mechanisms that are being used, but I want to make the point that I think David made earlier in his first presentation, that the border enforcement on the border is incredibly inefficient. We've reached a point of rapidly diminishing returns on focusing on getting bulk cash at the border or weapons going across the border, because if you've been on the border and spent time down there and talked to people down there, the whole mechanism is set up for the cartels to succeed in moving their product through at that particular point. You have multiple points of entries, multiple lanes, and the halcones from the cartels just sit there and look and see which lanes are being monitored, which aren't. With constant radio communications, they move the couriers across lanes into different points of entry, because we can't do all the points of entry all the time. And also, every minute you add to the trucks crossing the border going either way has a huge economic cost. And every time you add 30 seconds or a minute and a half to inspections, you're ultimately costing hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit traffic every year that damage both countries. So that point of interdiction, you can spend another $8 or $10, $100 million there, and in the process do another $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion worth of damage to the legitimate economy. So that's an incredibly, and it's set up, as I said, for those guys to see. There's virtually no way, unless you're incredibly lucky or have very good intelligence, that you're going to pick out the right car, because these guys simply have all the mechanisms in place, or they simply abort. They get halfway in the lane change, they're going to inspect that lane, they walk away from their car. That's it, goodbye. And they lose $10,000. Big deal. So I think that's a very important point to keep in mind on the border control area. As David said, there are other ways of getting at that, at the bundling centers, but you can only do that with good human intelligence. On the diversification, one of the things that I found really striking in doing the research here and dealing with both Mexican and U.S. Law enforcement folks is that there are now more than a dozen PayPal-like entities, and PayPal, by the way, gets uniformly very high marks for its compliance and its willingness to track illicit finance or suspicious activities. But there are more than a dozen other PayPal-like mechanisms that move billions of dollars outside of any accounting mechanism that any country has in place, because they're virtual, they're offshore, they're very difficult to identify which jurisdiction they're actually operating in. Some of those jurisdictions don't have any laws against what they're doing anyway. If they do, how do you get at that particular server, etc. So there are in and of itself, that's one gigantic hole, and I think it would be fair to say that the narcos have studied this in some detail and probably have a fairly good handle on how to work those systems. The other thing you're seeing, which I think is very dangerous for both Mexico and further south, is the emergence of Russian organized crime families moving in significant ways into the money laundering sphere. And if you look at how Russian organized crime has controls banks and controls the bulletproof servers that they use in their own criminal activities at home and abroad. You can simply put your money into Russian banks in the United States or elsewhere, move it out of the country, and have it appear in Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, El Salvador, wherever you want it to appear, with virtually no trace in the U.S. financial system. And our focus on getting a broader understanding of that is imperative. We're only beginning to look at that. And the other thing I found fascinating, because I don't inhabit that world, my children do, is the virtual worlds that exist out there and the ability to accumulate real wealth in virtual worlds in the games that they play now, and then transfer that wealth virtually to people in other countries and extract it there. So while we're focusing a tremendous amount of energy on bulk cash, and as I say, it's not that bulk cash is not important, because it is the walking around cash that allows you to pay the hitmen to do their specific jobs, etc. But it's not the financial backbone of these organizations. And so I think we need to sort of reorient how we look at it. I think that also the diversification of the cartels into different activities makes hurting them on the external front much more difficult. I think somebody mentioned it, Edgardo Buscaglia now has cataloged 23 criminal activities that the cartels routinely engage in. You see the Zetas muscling into the coyote trade to take over that, and that may be the reason for the mass murder recently of the folks in the desert. You see them involved in stealing petroleum from Pemex and reselling it on the markets. You see them involved, obviously, in the kidnappings. You have the narcomenudeo, the small-sale retail stuff on the corners, which drives a huge amount of the violence. I think this is the other thing that we underestimate in looking at how the money and drugs flow, is that a lot of the violence in Ciudad Juarez and elsewhere is driven by the phenomenon of the Mexicans doing what the Colombians did before them, and that is paying more and more of their local work in product. They'll dump a kilo or 2 kilos or 3 kilos, which means that if you're the guy in Ciudad Juarez getting paid, you have to sell that product on the street to get your money, which means you're going to fight with everybody else who's trying to control that street corner to also sell their product. And you have this huge amount of violence that circulates solely around the local drug sale, because otherwise the people involved don't get any cash for what they've just done. So I think that, in looking at how things are likely to develop, there are many also internal problems, I think, in Mexico that folks are fairly well aware of. One of the most sort of interesting little datos I was doing in the research earlier was that the budget within the Treasury Department, Ministerio de Hacienda in Mexico, the budget for internal publicity was higher than the budget for the Financial Investigative Unit. It was like 0.007%. That's changed. It's gone up. There's some progress being made. They're very difficult for investigators to get information from the police and vice versa. They don't have to exchange information. One side can ask the other side for information. The other side can say, no thank you, or delay it 6 months, or do whatever they want to do. So there are many mechanical problems there. There's the whole problem of the notarias públicas, where a lot of things are supposed to be registered. They're not computerized. Every state and every town has their own one. So to find out land registries, etc., you have to go to each place and pull them out. There's no centralized way of doing that. The vigilance on the dollar transactions is often ignored. The casas de cambio, etc., the controls there. And again, you run always into the problem of how much you want to enforce versus how much you're going to impact legitimate business. Because the latest laws that are going to make people begin reporting down to much smaller levels, essentially, I argue, it happened after the chapter was written, it will bury the people in paperwork and be completely useless. My experience in this country working on terror finance issues in the aftermath of 9/11 was that the fear of noncompliance drove people in this country, institutions in this country, to report everything, which meant that nothing got analyzed properly simply because there was so much paperwork that by the time FinCEN or somebody traced a suspicious activity, it had happened 6 months before, because that's the way the system works. So there's the constant, our instinctive reaction is to regulate and to put laws on the books and to make people report things. And we may have to rethink that, because that ultimately often will just bury the process. So I think it's a very complex system. I think I do share the assessment that getting at the financial structures is crucial. But I do think very strongly that we also have to stop looking at the 1980s and 1990s as models and start looking at the 21st and 22nd century, where those guys are already operating. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks very much. We have some time for questions and comments, and we have a microphone that we use to go. And I prefer to do a round of 3 questions, and if you have a comment, just say it's a comment. Don't disguise it as a question. But also, please just briefly identify yourself and then make your question or comment, and we'll do a first round, and then hope we have time to do another round. There's a gentleman in the back, please. You see his hand there? And then down here, we'll do you in the front.
Hi, my name is Sam Logan. I'm with Southern Pulse. Question for Doug Farah. You mentioned that a lot of times these individuals at the lower level of the organizational pyramid, if you will, are paid with product. In your research, did you find if any of them are paid in dollars?
Let me do my round, and then I'll give you a chance. There was a gentleman here in the front. Would you please bring that mic? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Oscar Rodriguez. I'm originally from the border, from the Ojinaga region. A question to Dolia Esteves. Do you believe, or do you see that? Do you think we're seeing a structural change, a very fundamental change in news reporting, certainly along the border, because of circumstances, with things like Blog del Narco, where people are directly reporting things, and that information is appearing in places that the public can get them? Blog del Narco. I hope you're familiar with that.
Thank you. Is there a question right here? But we'll take our third question and then do our first round. Thank you.
Hi, yes, Benjamin Bodner from the Rendon Group. This is directed to Daniel Sabat. I just wanted to know if you had anything to comment on the prison system in addition to the police forces.
Good. Doug, would you please start out?
On the question of whether the folks are paid in dollars on the border, yes, I think there's significant amounts of dollars that flow, but I think that I hesitate to say a huge trend, but I think that the trend tracks with the violence of doing that less and paying with product more. I think that it's fairly safe to say that's one of the trends driving the violence. I think when they have the dollars, the people prefer to receive the dollars. I think part of the things that narcos have done is recruit many more people, so there's much more competition for carrying out the hits and belonging into the force, which makes paying dollars more difficult or paying cash more difficult. And I think this is one way of sort of controlling that competition. If you can sell your kilo, good for you. If not, you're kind of screwed, and that's your problem. So I think yes is the short answer.
Dolia, would you please?
I think there has been that kind of evolution, if you want to call it, because as the traditional media, which is the print media specifically, and obviously also electronic media, radio and television, are more and more intimidated, and the reporters are known. It's known who they are. This blog del Narco, I don't know who they are. Do you know? No. So that's the thing. They can just report, and they can get away with reporting the truth. I understand they were the first ones to report some big shooting in, I don't know if Reynosa or Ciudad Juarez or somewhere. And a lot of the major newspapers in the United States, like Los LA Times and others, are looking into these blog del Narco and other ones to find information that the traditional media can't report for fear of survival. So yes, as long as the reporter remains anonymous, they can report whatever they want. There was a case of the lapolaca.com, and he asked for asylum in the United States, and he was granted asylum. This set a very important precedent, the first reporter ever to be granted an asylum from Mexico, because he received a lot of death threats. But he was a known person. He had La Polaca, he was the editor, he appeared in news conferences or showed up to cover events. My understanding is that the big shield they have, this blog del Narco, is that you don't know who they are. But on the other hand, you can't trust 100% what they're reporting, like all the blogs. It's the same thing with any blog.
I don't know as much about the prison system, but yes, major problems in the prison system, enormous problems the usual problem of fear of it being universities of crime, and then the added problem of corruption. And there's been several prominent jailbreaks where prison authorities have been involved in those jailbreaks. So an area of major problems. And I think thinking about the prison system really gets us to think about is that, if we focus on police reform and on fixing the police, which is what a lot of the resources have really been focused on, well, you still have the broader justice system, and then you have the end of the justice system, which is the prison system, and much, much less attention has been placed on those two areas than has been placed on reforming the police. So even as limited as the police reform is, in many ways, it's still miles ahead of where reform is in the justice system and in the prison system. I would refer you, though, to several studies that have been done by investigators at CIDE in Mexico City who have done a very good job at looking at some of the prison system issues in Mexico.
Thank you. Let's do another. A gentleman in the back there, please.
Hi, Robert Donnelly, Woodrow Wilson Center, Mexico Institute. I have a question for Doug. When you mentioned that 60 to 70% of what I heard illicit U.S. drug sales returning to South America to purchase new product, I was wondering maybe if you could explain to us how you came up with that number, and if we can extrapolate and say that therefore 60 to 70% of illicit drug sales come from South American product, i.e. cocaine. if you could give us a little bit of guidance there, because that seems to be the linchpin for the argument that we should be looking at non-bulk cash smuggling enforcement.
Doug, please.
Well, the number I used was about 60-70% of the profits or the money generated by drug sales here is used to purchase more product in Latin America. The profit margin of the cartels, and if you look at the price paid on the ground for coca, the price paid for the coca base when it's processed, the price paid for HCl in country, and then the sales value in the United States. That's how I sort of extrapolated out the amount. And I was talking to people who, both in Colombia and Mexico, who are involved in the drug trade, who estimated that if you sell $1 million worth of dope here, you're going to pay $700,000 of that back into the system to get more product moving up. Your profit margin, your gross margin, will be about 30%. Of that, you have to pay your bribes, you have to pay your own security forces, you have to buy your weapons, you have to do all this stuff. So ultimately, the cartels move massive amounts of money, but the profit margins are more dispersed than they were before. It's not they're making less, but it has to go further because, and now you see them, the SET is recruiting the Caibiles from Guatemala, which costs more. They're recruiting the special forces, trained guys from both sides of the wars and war in El Salvador. All these people cost more money. They're hiring some of the upper level Mara folks to do some of their security. You have a lot more halcones on the border. You have all of these, and they're fighting each other, so you have a lot more security concerns there. So they're macro accumulation of wealth, it probably is not nearly as great as it once was, but the wealth that's accumulated is distributed much better. It's a much more collectivized system now because they need to spend more to stay in business. So that was my methodology in that. And looking, I can give you, if you want, I didn't put in there the numbers. The numbers on the ground are fairly well tracked. It's not hard to find out how much kilo of coca goes for and what the transport is. And out of that 30%, they also have to pay part of their, that's the transport cost of stuff moving back and all. So it's more money than you or I make combined, but it's not like Pablo Escobar, who is able to ship tons back and then get dollars back and have, $800 million in profits all of a sudden. I think it's much more fragmented now.
Gentlemen, the lady here, and then the gentleman in the front, please. Go ahead.
This is also a question for Doug.
Quick idea of yours.
I am Cindy Buell,
thank you.
Congressman Jim McGovern. If we're several steps behind where things are, money laundering may be happening today, where should we be focusing? Does that require new legal authority, that is to say, my institution to act, or is it within law enforcement and justice institutions that they need to do something different, and what are those institutional obstacles that are keeping that from happening?
Then we have one here in the front, I think. Thanks.
Steve Kelly from Duke University. I have a question for the moderator.
Sure.
You asked them all to talk about trends. And so we've learned that money launderers are getting smarter and more journalists are being victimized and silenced, and the government spending more on police work but perhaps seeing a decline in effectiveness. So for the average person in the public, if you could step back from each one of those micro cases, what's the trend in successfully battling organized crime in Mexico?
Mm-hmm. Is there another? Good. Doug, would you please?
On where we should be looking, I think that essentially you have to be aware of the multiple new venues available for laundering money, which I think we're only starting to look at on the law enforcement side here. Seriously, I think you have to. I think a lot of times, and I'm not different from this myself in a lot of ways, you like to do what you know how to do. And we know how to do bulk cash. And I don't say bulk cash like I said it's not important. I think we should do it. But we know what we do and we do it, and so we keep doing it. And I think that we sort of have to break out of that paradigm and start looking at what does dollarization mean? How does money move into Salvadoran accounts? How does money move into Ecuador accounts? How do these PayPal systems work, and is there something we can do to shut them down or make them more difficult or make them more accountable? Is there a way to force them into know your customer type things that PayPal does, et cetera? But I don't think that I don't know what the legal authorities involved are. Honestly, I really don't. But I do think that the other key to all of this is, and I push it hard in all of my presentations, is the ability to develop working relationships in countries that we're concerned about through vetted units, primarily small vetted units initially, which have often gone awry. But I think that the idea of macro reforming the financial structures and the police is just not going to happen in our lifetime, probably. I was telling somebody earlier, I remember I had a conversation with General Rosso Serrano in Colombia, and I was horrified when he said, forget police reform. We're not going to do police reform in Colombia. We can't. We're at war. We're going to do smaller units. We're going to create special anti-narcotics units. We'll grow those out into trusted units that will eventually have an impact. And I think in the long term, that's basically how you have to think about this in Central America, Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Ecuador, building relationships will allow you to understand what's going on there instead of operating sort of in a vacuum the way we do now.
Thanks. The kind of general impression about directions in this struggle with organized crime, the indicators that are used, there are various types. The Mexicans have gathered a good bit of data on the kinds of things you think you'd look at: weapons, vehicles, product, money, prisoners, that sort of thing. And all of those indicators are very positive in the sense that the first 3 years of the Calderon administration, on several of those indicators, they had surpassed the record of the previous two administrations. Those indicators, though, are less salient than the political indicators, which are the level of violence and the kind of taking down of major kingpins. And the violence issue hasn't seemed to turn the corner, if that's where it's really headed. And the kingpins, that's kind of important, but hard to measure. The Mexicans have had much more success in the recent years in capturing several important traffickers. The symbolic one, of course, is this Guzman. It's Chapo Guzman, and that's kind of the Osama bin Guzman of the equation, and he's nowhere to be found. And that would be a major breakthrough. And the reason I say that is not just the case of that person, but it has to do with public opinion. And public opinion is the key judge of which way is this struggle moving. And the public opinion, the way I've read it is, in the short term, typically the question is, do you think the government is winning this, or do you think the traffickers are winning this? And the short-term answer is, well, the government's not winning it. And then the next question is, do you think over the long term the government will win? And the answer, the majority thinks, well, yes, that the government will prevail. My sense is, and I go back to the point I was trying to make at the start, what's really interesting to me is the party system doesn't connect with the problem. And these problems are very, very dense. It's a bit like climate change. We're not quite sure what causes it, not quite sure what kinds of interventions will work. But we are sure that unless the party system can reach to the conclusion that this is a systemic challenge and begin to move from that sense of partisan advantage to what kind of a cooperation, or what kind of a pact, or what kind of a state policy might actually work. I'm very concerned about that. And given the political calendar, the parties are really looking at this as an opportunity to get an edge and an opportunity to punish government. So I don't see any progress on that. The other side is this problem of coordination, and Eric Olson and others have studied this at great length, but that's really very serious. There is a fellow named Jorge Carrillo Lea, who is a very important person in the sense that he's a former head of the intelligence service and a former governor and a former army general. And he wrote an op-ed in one of the newspapers, and the title of it was "The War Between the Army and the Navy." Now, this strikes me as tremendously important, that the level of cooperation is not good. And the cooperation between the services and the police is not good. And the cooperation amongst the levels of government also is problematic. So in terms of trends, we have these numbers and these issues, and the violence certainly is the priority. But these other kinds of political problems, I don't see those corners being turned quite yet. So the difficulty is getting worse rather than better, at least in the short term, until there is some kind of a political breakthrough that could lead to an agreement amongst the main actors, and then that would translate, I would hope, into really much better coordination amongst those various agents that are involved in the actual on-the-ground fight. So in the short term, my sense of it is rather negative. The positive side, of course, is there is very important cooperation between the two countries, and I see that trend to be a very positive trend. So mixed picture, but I think more negative than positive. Let me do another round. Please, this gentleman here.
Sergio de la Peña from L3. This is a question that I'm having a hard time conceptualizing, but is there a way that, Doug, you can address the seam that is obviously there between the drugs that are coming up from Mexico, the distribution systems that are existing, and how that somehow transfer over into the United States? We're focused on Mexico, but in the United States, there's this massive distribution system that allows for product and money to make transfers and so forth, and I don't see that we've ever addressed how that seam works. What are the organizations that are involved in the process? For example, you've got Mexican drug cartels that are shipping things north, but obviously once it comes to the United States, you have Mexican cartels operating in the United States, you have Russian cartels operating in the United States, you have Italian cartels. You know, you name the race that you want to come up with, and there's somebody there. Can you talk to that? And I'm not really sure that I've made my question very clear, but it's a little complex for me to
answer will be vague too. Then
I hope you picked Doug for your answer for that. Good. Others, though, if you have a thought, please.
Down in front of your gentleman.
Go ahead.
Diana Negroponte, the Brookings Institution. I'm developing a hypothesis which I want to test with the panel. John, you talked about coordination within the Mexican state. I am seeing a coordination among the cartels based on the growing dominance of Sinaloa, which appears to have the preferred among the Mexican government. That is, that the Mexican government would prefer Sinaloa to win out and to seek to defeat the Zetas. Because as there has been this focus on the kingpins, it's the kingpins of the Zetas which are being addressed rather than the leadership of the Sinaloa. If Sinaloa, together with La Familia de Michoacán, my good neighbor, the former governor, were to become the dominant force, that they would then succeed in weakening Zetas, weakening Felix Arellano on the California border, then do you have the emergence of a coordinated, single, narco organization with whom you can make a deal.
Then please.
I'm Ted Wilkinson, former Foreign Service, and my question is maybe not as macro as Diana's, but it's to Daniel Sabat, and it's about Tijuana. We've been reading and hearing that the situation in Tijuana had improved substantially, and that whatever the reasons were, that the police appeared to be more professional and more controlled. But there's a very disturbing New Yorker piece, letter from Tijuana, written by William Finnegan from 10 days ago, which cites a number of cases where the police were actually brutalized and perhaps deprofessionalized by a very autocratic police director.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on the situation now in Tijuana?
We start with Sergio's question about. I think it was the word was seam. That is the border.
Right.
Please. Yeah.
Well, I think, and I'm be interested to read. I haven't actually read the chapter on the distribution of black tar heroin, on looking at how that works. But my sense is, from looking at this for many years, is that you have a fairly centralized method of getting stuff across the border, as each cartel controls its plazas and has its methodologies. But once it crosses the border, and I think this is one of the huge advantages that the Mexicans have, the Colombians didn't have, you have a large internal community in which you can move relatively undetected if you want to be doing illicit activities. The Colombians had to be a little more careful, and they finally withdrew from the U.S. distribution game because, one, it was dangerous for them, they were much more easily identified, and two, the Mexicans were pressuring them to retire. So the Colombians essentially withdrew from their internal U.S. Trafficking structures. But the way it generally works here is that you'll have one or two people in different geographic regions, primarily cities, that control that. There's not the macro control of cartels, in my opinion, in this country. We get asked a lot, why don't you talk about the U.S. cartels, et cetera, et cetera. My strong sense is because they largely don't exist in that form. As somebody said, you have maybe you said it's multiple ethnic organizations, multiple national crime organizations, take it down to the street level. You don't have the Sinaloa cartel delivers it across the country to major distributors who then distribute it down. It's not unlike any product that arrives in mass from any country. It's distributed across the country to retail outlets. In the countries, then the producer in the initial stage doesn't control the sale of the dresses at Kmart that come from China, or what happens in that particular Kmart store, just as the narcos in Mexico or the Sinaloa cartel doesn't control how that kilo is distributed once it hits one of maybe 10 Chicago handlers. They deliver their loads there, and then that's it. They get their money, and they're pretty much, and they have enforcers to make sure they don't get cheated, but they don't run that distribution. Then that enters a whole different sort of fragmented distribution system that's different in each country. The money is a little different. They have to get their money back, and so they have to have aggregation points. So they have to be able to move to safe houses away from the border and then transport that money down. So to me, that's sort of the big vulnerability, not on the distribution side, but on the collection of money side, because without that money, then their entire thing they've done has been in vain, and they understand that. So I think it's sort of the reverse of the drugs going north, is the consolidation and then repositioning on the border, and then fragmentation again as it goes across in smaller groups or gets distributed elsewhere. But they do have to, at some point, aggregate their cash. And that is where I think you have the highest probability of doing significant damage to them there. And then to Dr. Negroponte's question on the cartels, the coordinated cartels have no country has ever succeeded in having a coordinated monolithic drug trafficking organization. They always fight with each other, they always get greedy, and they always start killing each other. In the short term, could you have a situation where you had enough control temporarily to negotiate with the government, or to, without negotiating with the government, lower the level of violence so public opinion dissipated? I would say probably yes. But could you have a single coordinated cartel? Maybe for about 3 minutes, and then you would have the Colombians tried it. They had their meetings, they had their organizational structures that divided the market, and they still kept killing each other. And I would gather that would be very similar in Mexico.
Dolly, do you want to take
yes.
You can combine the two questions if you like, or the two comments.
I agree with what Doc said about the difficulties of having a coordinated single macro narco organization you can deal with or negotiate with. What it is true is that, and one wonders what's driving this high level of popularity of the PRI in early polls before the 2012 elections. And speaking to my relatives in northern Mexico or Mexico City, there's this nostalgia about the PRI, that the PRI was able to get them under control. And so if some academics here, there was a conference not long ago at the Heritage Foundation in which some academics do believe that the PRI has in their DNA, I'm sorry, in their DNA how to bargain, so that they indeed win in 2012. They will make a deal, whether it's with a single macro narco organization or the Sinaloa cartel or whatever, they will, and this will bring down the level of violence, which is probably the number one priority for any Mexican that lives in Mexico. So if they say, okay, if that prick can do this, why not, Because there is a sense that somehow you can't fight them, that there's a big consumption market that we live next to, and that this is not going to go away, that there's arms coming into Mexico every day, thousands of them, and that the Americans can't do anything because it's in the Constitution or don't want to do anything. There's an article today in the Washington Post, very interesting about it. So why are we going to be putting to death people and the insecurity? So maybe the PRI can make a deal with them, if not explicitly, implicitly, and bring down violence, which is ultimately what any citizen in Mexico, every citizen, want.
Dan, you get the last word, please, on Tijuana?
I also wanted to jump in. Do I have time to jump in on Diana's question?
You get a shot at this question. Go ahead.
No, I think it's an interesting question. And I don't know why this notion has persisted that the Sinaloa cartel is somehow a better option, and it is. I mean, we've heard it from many government officials that these are good old-fashioned, old-time drug traffickers that we can somehow relate to, and these upstart Zetas are very violent, and I don't contest the issue of the Zetas being awful, but Sinaloa is involved in every single conflict that's going on in the country, and so this notion that somehow Sinaloa is a preferred option when every time there's been peace, it's been Sinaloa trying to get into a plaza that has led to the violence. So that notion that Sinaloa is somehow more kind of has these old-fashioned drug trafficking values, I'm not such a fan of. Yeah, whatever those are. But then what I've been waiting to emerge that has never emerged is not a one cartel controlling the situation, but a balance of cartels between the different actors. And that seems to me, if you could obtain a balance of power between different major players and different major traffickers, then some kind of agreement could be reached where it's no longer in anybody's incentive it hasn't been in anyone's interest to fight this long, in my view, but in any case, they haven't arrived at that realization. And where you have a state that's able to enforce and go after extreme behavior that goes outside of the bounds of what is somehow appropriate for organized crime to do. And that balance of power has not emerged, and every time that you've seen to get to cartels kind of lining up, there's been a switch. Somebody's moved sides, or somebody's been killed, or somebody's been arrested, and so the balance of power kind of constantly shifts, and so we've never arrived at that equilibrium. But I would imagine that we'll get out of this more when there's a balance of power than when there's one group that can dominate. So that would be my take on that question. The Tijuana question. Gosh, I mean, there is good news out of Tijuana. I mean, there is better coordination there between state, municipal, and federal. You have the municipal police involved in the issue, and as opposed to the rest of the country where the municipal police is turning a blind eye and saying, this is a federal issue. And you have good coordination there. And I mean, Zeta magazine, which is a very critical source, last year had Lezaola, who's the head of the municipal police, along with Duran, who's the head of the military, as their people of the year. I mean, and this is a very critical voice in Tijuana society. So for them to say these two military leaders are people of the year for Tijuana, that's significant endorsement in my view. But how has that been done? And have the human rights of police officers been violated in cleaning things up in Tijuana? And we should add the caveat that the violence continues and is still very bad in Tijuana. I mean, we can't overstate, and I think the article is very clear on that point, and also Randy Archibald's piece today in the New York Times makes that point, that violence is still pretty bad in Tijuana, so that we shouldn't kind of be lulled into this myth that Tijuana is somehow this wonderful success story. But what any incoming police administrator faces, and they're going to change every 3 years, at least every 3 years, and they come in, and because everything is so executive driven and because there are such weak institutions, the new police chief comes in and they have this problem. They know they have corruption somewhere in their police force, and so how are they going to address that problem? And the typical solution has been, I'm going to appoint people in the upper ranks that I trust and that I know, and I'm going to try to marginalize those that I think might be bad. And that might work for a limited period of time, but it doesn't really solve the problem. And so Lezola has tried a different approach, which is to be very, very aggressive and abusive towards, and we think torture some police officers, or at least those are the allegations. But the real problem here is that you don't have some kind of institutional mechanism for accountability. You don't even have evaluations where a new police chief can come into office and have a sense of who the good guys and who the bad guys are or might be. And so in an environment where you don't have institutional mechanisms, what are you going to see happen? And either you're going to see the continuation of corruption or you're going to see these kinds of abuses. And so the real key is to think, how can we build those anti-corruption kinds of institutions to avoid either one of those two extremes?
I want to thank the panelists for fine quality presentations. Thank you all very much. We have some fresh coffee. We have some fresh coffee, some tea, and we invite you to take a break, and we will reassemble in about 10 minutes. So please, thank you.